Chapter 11. The Benefit of Emptiness. One day, a 59-year-old man asked his wife where his wife was. Fred, the pseudonym given this man by the researchers who wrote up his case in the journal Neurological Science, wasn't kidding. On her surprised answer that she was right there, the researchers wrote, he firmly denied that she was his wife. The problem wasn't that Fred didn't recognize his wife's face. Clearly, this woman looked like his wife, but he insisted that she was a double. His actual wife, he speculated, had gone out and would return later. Fred suffered from Capgras delusion, which consists of being convinced that someone, usually a relative, sometimes a close friend, is an imposter, and a very good imposter, an exact replica, on the outside at least, but not on the inside. This person may look exactly like, say, your mother, but she lacks what we might call essence of mother. Essence, as we've seen, is central to the Buddhist concept of emptiness. At least its absence is central to the concept of emptiness. The idea of emptiness is that, while the things we perceive out there in the world do in some sense exist, they lack this thing called essence. So when Fred looked at his wife and didn't see essence of wife, was he experiencing emptiness? Was he poised on the threshold of Buddhist enlightenment? No. The idea of enlightenment is to lose your delusions, whereas to start thinking that your wife isn't your wife is to gain a delusion. Hence the term Capgras delusion. Whatever was going on in Fred's brain, it wasn't what Buddhists mean by enlightenment. At the same time, I think Fred's brain may have something in common with the brain of someone who, while in a deep meditative state, sees the world as wholly or partially empty. And I think this prospect may shed important light on the experience of emptiness, what it is, why people experience it, and what we should make of it. No one knows for sure what causes Capgras delusion, but a long-standing theory is that it results from a disruption of the connection between a part of the brain involved in visual processing, maybe the fusiform gyrus, which figures in facial recognition, and a part of the brain that processes emotions, such as the amygdala. What is clear is that there is some shortage of affect, of feeling. The feelings typically evoked by, say, your mother, just aren't there. And if seeing somebody doesn't make you feel the way seeing your mother makes you feel, how could that person be your mother? Identifying human beings is something we normally think of as a straightforward act of visual perception. It seems like the kind of thing a computer could do. In fact, computers do a good job of it, just by scanning faces. But apparently human beings have a more complicated way of identifying things, not just by how they look, but how they make you feel. At least, to judge by Capgras delusion, that seems to be the case when we're identifying friends and relatives. Is that the case with lots of other things? Is our recognition of the house we live in and the car we drive, even the computer we use, dependent on our feelings about these things? Or, even if the absence of those feelings didn't impede recognition per se, would it overhaul our view of what these things are and what they mean? Does the meaning of the word ocean, not the dictionary meaning, but the actual meaning of the word to you, depend on a melange of feelings that you've come to associate with oceans? If you were suddenly cut off from those associations, would the ocean seem, well, empty? I suspect so, and I think this can help explain how the Buddhist doctrine of emptiness arose. Meditation can weaken the link between perceptions and thoughts on the one hand, and the feelings, the affective resonances that typically accompany them. Well, if you do a really thorough job of that weakening, and perceptions become increasingly free of affective associations, this could change your view of the world. It could leave things looking the same on the outside, but seeming as if they lack some inner something. In the words of the Samadhiraja Sutra, They would seem without essence, but with qualities that can be seen. Maybe when the Buddhist idea of emptiness first took shape, it took shape in the minds of people who meditated very, very deeply, so deeply that the normal affective coloring of the world fell almost completely away. Maybe as the feelings associated with various things faded, those things seemed transformed, deprived of a certain kind of substance. One reason to doubt this possibility is that you may not think of yourself as having really strong feelings about, say, the ocean or your computer, at least not so strong as to be integral to their very identities. But I want to make the case that feelings play a bigger role in perception than we normally appreciate. The first piece of evidence is Capgras delusion itself, evidence that, notwithstanding the common sense division of the brain into cognitive and affective activities, the simple cognitive act of identifying someone can depend on affective response. After I trot out exhibits B and C, maybe it will seem more plausible that the doctrine of emptiness, before it was a doctrine, before Buddhist philosophers had articulated and defended it, was just an experiential apprehension had by people. Exotic and ordinary essence. The psychologist Paul Bloom has written that essentialism, the tendency to attribute inner essences to things, is a human universal. Some of his examples of essentialism are exotic. Someone paid $48,875 for a tape measure that was owned by John F. Kennedy, apparently motivated by a sense that it was imbued with some sort of presidential essence. Some of Bloom's examples are less exotic. A wedding ring typically evokes feelings, in the wearer at least, that an identical-looking ring wouldn't evoke. But both the tape measure and the wedding ring are in some sense special, and the same is true of many things that project a particularly strong sense of essence. Bloom writes in his book, How Pleasure Works, that such an object is special because of its history, either through its relation to admired people or significant events, or its connection to someone of personal significance. This history is invisible and intangible, and in most cases there is no test that can ever distinguish the special object from one that looks the same. But still it gives us pleasure, and the duplicate would leave us cold. Bloom thinks people are naturally essentialists in a broader sense than this, and I agree. In fact, that's part of the point of this chapter, that people infuse even things not special in Bloom's sense of the term with affectively charged essences. To make this case, I'll become, by necessity, somewhat speculative, because I don't know a lot of neuroscientific or even psychological research about how people feel about stuff like trains and trucks. There's been a long-standing school of thought which holds that ordinary things do evoke affective reactions, if subtle ones. In 1980, the psychologist Robert Zoniak, expressing what was then a somewhat eccentric view, wrote, "There are probably very few perceptions and cognitions in everyday life that don't have a significant affective component, that aren't hot or in the very least tepid. And perhaps all perceptions contain some affect. We do not just see a house, we see a handsome house, an ugly house, or a pretentious house. We do not just read an article on attitude change, on cognitive dissonance, or on herbicides. We read an exciting article on attitude change, an important article on cognitive dissonance, or a trivial article on herbicides." Note, by the way, that Zoniak implicitly equates having feelings about things with making judgments about them. This equation is true to the Darwinian view, laid out in Chapter 3, that functionally speaking, feelings are judgments. It's also true to the meditative technique of relaxing judgment by critically inspecting our feelings. But I digress. Zayans continues, and the same goes for a sunset, a lightning flash, a flower, a dimple, a hangnail, a cockroach, the taste of quinine, saumur, the color of earth in Umbria, the sound of traffic on 42nd Street, and equally for the sound of a 1000 Hz tone and the sight of the letter Q. The letter Q? That may be carrying it a bit too far, but not by much. I do think that in addition to reacting affectively to particular things, that particularly handsome car, that particularly ugly car, we develop affective reactions to generic things, such as cars in general. Take tape measures. I really like them, even the non-presidential kind. I like extending them and using them to get the answer to a question I have. How long is the fluorescent light bulb that needs replacing? And I like the feeling of letting them snap back into their coil. I don't generally pause in a hardware store to relish the sight of a tape measure, but I suspect that when I see one, I have a subtly positive response. And this is part of my conception of a tape measure, part of what a tape measure means to me. You can see why the experiments we can run with really special items, like JFK's tape measure or Goring's fake Vermeer, are hard to run when we're dealing with less special items. With special items, the affective connotation is a product of an explicit belief about the history of the item, so you can just tell the person that the belief is in fact false, and then gauge the impact this news has on affect. But there's no comparable manipulation you can perform with much less special objects. You can't convince me that the many positive experiences I've had with tape measures didn't actually happen. And it probably wouldn't matter if you could, because my favorable disposition toward tape measures isn't the result of a conscious belief about my history with them anyway. It's the result of the emotional conditioning that happened unconsciously during that history. The infiltration of perception by feeling. Still, there's lots of evidence that people do tend to attach positive and negative associations to just about every kind of thing there is. There are two ways to show this, one subtle and cleverly revealing, and one not so subtle. The not so subtle way is just to ask people what they think of things. In one study, people were shown pictures of things and asked to rate their goodness or badness on a scale of 4 to -4. Some of the pictures evoked stark and predictable judgments. Swans were strongly positive. Serpents' heads and bugs were strongly negative. Some of the pictures evoked more muted responses. Chains and brooms and garbage cans were, on average, rated somewhat negatively, pumpkins and toothbrushes and envelopes somewhat positively. The more subtle and cleverly revealing way to explore people's affective judgments goes beyond the question of whether people are natural evaluators and asks whether they're automatic evaluators. In other words, do they have affective reactions to things before they even have time to really think about them? This question is explored through a process known as priming. Suppose you're shown two words in succession, and you're told that when you see the second word, you should pronounce it out loud. It turns out that when the second word is robin, you'll utter it sooner, by a fraction of a second, than if the first word is bird. The word bird has primed your brain to respond to related words. This is called semantic priming. There is also something you could call affective priming. If you're shown the word sunshine, you'll more rapidly react to the word glorious than if you'd been shown the word disease. Likewise, you'll react to the word horrible more quickly if first shown the word disease than if shown the word sunshine. These experiments aren't, of course, saying anything about what you feel when you reflect at length on disease. Things happen too fast for conscious reflection to matter. The presentation of the prime, the brief interval, and the presentation of the target word all happen in less than half a second. In fact, the effect holds up even if the prime is presented so briefly that the person isn't consciously aware of seeing it. So what these experiments show is that the word disease, before you call it consciously to mind, already has a negative tag. That's not too surprising. Disease is pretty horrible, and sunshine is pretty glorious. But we see the same dynamic with less obviously evocative things. In fact, the experimenters who surveyed people about their reactions to mundane things, to chains and brooms and garbage cans, to pumpkins and toothbrushes and envelopes, took those same pictures and, using a new group of people, did the priming experiments with them. And it turned out that yes, pictures that had been judged negatively by the first group, the group asked to consciously evaluate them, were tended to be judged negatively by the second group, the group that didn't even realize they were judging them, but by the speed of their reactions to subsequently displayed positive or negative words, rendered implicit judgments. So Zayance seems to have been right. Human beings are automatic evaluators. We tend to assign adjectives to nouns, whether consciously or unconsciously, explicitly or implicitly. When you think about it, Zayance almost had to be right. From natural selection's point of view, the whole point of perception is to process information that has relevance to the organism's Darwinian interests, that is, to its chances of getting its genes spread. And organisms register this relevance by assigning positive or negative values to the perceived information. We are designed to judge things and to encode those judgments in feelings. With a species as complicated as ours, it may or may not always be obvious what relevance things have to Darwinian interests. Tape measures, for example, weren't part of the hunter-gatherer landscape in which we evolved, but were designed by natural selection to get satisfaction out of finding the answers to questions. And over time, when I've asked how long something is, tape measures have given me the answer. Maybe that's why I've come to like them. Or maybe it has to do with how using a tape measure makes me feel about myself. A fact that may in turn be grounded in my watching various role models use them when I was a kid. Anyway, to be clear, the claim isn't that everything I feel positively or negatively about will actually have an accordingly positive or negative impact on my chances of spreading my genes. The claim is just that the machinery in my mind that assigns feelings to things was originally designed to maximize genetic proliferation. That it no longer reliably does so is among the absurdities of being a human. The disturbing invisibility of my brother. One more clarification before we get back to emptiness. I'm not claiming that everyone has an affective reaction to everything. The studies I just described, like most studies, reported only aggregate statistics. Buried within that aggregation are particular subjects who reacted neutrally to particular words or pictures. And that's not surprising. After all, even back in our hunter-gatherer days, the landscape featured things that didn't affect our chances of spreading genes one way or the other. So there have always been things that didn't evoke much in the way of feelings. Then again, things like that are things organisms don't pay much attention to in the first place, precisely because they're not important in Darwinian terms. The things organisms do pay attention to, on the other hand, do tend to be of Darwinian significance, and so will tend to evoke feelings. As a result, the perceptual landscape, the landscape of things that we're paying attention to, the things that dominate our consciousness, will tend to be infused, however subtly, with feeling. If there's something you don't have any feelings at all about, you probably won't much notice it in the first place. It may be only a slight exaggeration to say there's no such thing as an immaculate perception. My older brother, after reaching the phase of middle age when women no longer paid much attention to him, said, "It isn't that they think I'm bad-looking, they just don't realize I exist." Exactly. As a heterosexual woman walks down a city block, there are tons of things she could focus on, so the first job of her perceptual apparatus is to filter out things that, with the most cursory, even unconscious appraisal, are seen to not merit extended conscious appraisal. Sadly, that category of things includes my brother, who, also sadly, was younger than I am now when he attained this status. But if things do merit further appraisal, the appraisal will ultimately be reflected in this woman's feeling. Attractive young male? Less attractive but kind-looking young male? Young male who is intriguingly attractive but looks like he may be insufferably egotistical. Male who is as old as my brother, but unlike my brother, drives a $70,000 car and wears a Rolex watch. All of these kinds of men elicit distinctive feelings. Anything that, by natural selection's lights, is worth paying much attention to at all should, in theory, trigger feelings. And feelings infuse things with essence. At least, that's my hypothesis, that the dampened sense of essence some meditators feel has a lot to do with dampened feelings. I once tried out this theory on the person I first heard talk about the formless, Rodney Smith. Rodney is a tall, gangly, gray-haired man with an evangelical air that is unusual among meditation teachers. If you put him behind a Southern Baptist church pulpit, he wouldn't seem out of place, until, at least, he started talking about the formless. In person, Rodney has a direct, no-nonsense style of speaking that can be a real time-saver. I once asked him what the relationship was between this formless thing he kept talking about and the Mahayana idea of emptiness. With a bit of a shrug and a dismissive wave of his hand, he said, "Same thing." It was some time after that exchange, during a longer conversation with him, that I decided to try out my theory that a dialing down of the affective reaction to things is what leads to the experience of emptiness. Rodney had been trying to explain to me what the experience of emptiness is like. On one hand, I gathered, there's a sense in which things in his perceptual field don't project their independent identities as strongly as they do for most of us. But, Rodney emphasized, you don't lose your ability to identify things. He said, you want to be able to pick up a pair of glasses and put it on, and not think that it's a pencil. You don't lose the shapes or colors of things, it's just that the space between them no longer divides. I asked, do you have less strong emotional reactions to things than you might otherwise have? Do you invest them less with kind of emotional content? He replied, that would make sense, wouldn't it? That if things weren't as substantial as you believe them to be, your reaction to things would also simmer. So that happens. You see, all the states of equanimity come through the realization that things aren't what we thought they were. I felt vindicated, but not completely vindicated. In one sense, Rodney was corroborating my theory. He was saying that yes, the perception of formlessness or emptiness is correlated with a dampened affective reaction to things, but his interpretation of this correlation seemed different from mine. Whereas I've been saying that the dampened affect leads to the perception of emptiness, he was saying that it's the other way around. The perception of emptiness dampens the affect. Once you see that the thing you're accustomed to reacting strongly to isn't much of a thing in the first place, it only makes sense to react less strongly. Which one of us is right? Maybe we both are. Or, at least, maybe the difference between what he's saying and what I'm saying isn't ultimately very meaningful. Remember, for starters, that when I talk about our affect being dampened, our feelings being subdued, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Indeed, I've tried to show why certain feelings are a poor guide to reality. And I've suggested, more broadly, that the entire infrastructure of feelings should be viewed with a certain suspicion, given that it was built by natural selection whose ultimate aim isn't to foster clear perceptions and thoughts, but rather to foster the kinds of perceptions and thoughts that have gotten genes spread in the past. So for me to characterize Rodney's experience as a dampening of feeling certainly isn't to say that it couldn't clarify his view of the world. With this in mind, let's look at the two key claims Rodney's making. 1. The apprehension of formlessness or emptiness is a truer perception of things than our ordinary view, and 2. The feelings we normally experience in reaction to these things aren't appropriate in light of the truth about them. These claims are consistent with what I'm saying. Rodney and I are just disagreeing over the mechanics of insight. He says, and here he reflects the orthodox position within Buddhism, that the clarity of vision leads to the dampening of feelings. I say that the dampening of feelings leads to the clarity of vision. Indeed, I'd almost go so far as to say the dampening of feelings is the clarity of vision. So finely is affect intertwined with perception, in particular with the perception of essence. Feelings and stories. There's one other thing that essence seems to be intertwined with: stories. The stories we are told about things and the stories we tell ourselves about things influence how we feel about those things, and presumably, thus shape the essence that we sense in them. If the story behind a tape measure is that it belonged to JFK, that implies a different feeling and a different essence than the story that the tape measure belongs to a plumber. If we think of ourselves as having a successful marriage and wonderful, thriving children, then the sight of our home probably gives off more positive vibes than if we think of ourselves as trapped in an oppressive marriage that has bred ne'er-do-well kids, and so on. This is a major theme of Bloom's, that the stories we tell about things, and thus the beliefs we have about their history and their nature, shape our experience of them, and thus our sense of their essence. One of his favorite examples is a study that involved wine connoisseurs. 40 of them deemed a Bordeaux with a premium label, Grand Cru class, worth drinking, but only 12 bestowed that honor on a Bordeaux labeled as mere table wine, vin de table. You've probably guessed the punchline. The two kinds of bottles contained one kind of wine. Wine is an especially clear example of how stories inform our pleasures. That was a very good year. But Bloom thinks that if you look closely enough, every pleasure has a consequential story behind it. He once said to me, "There's no such thing as a simple pleasure. There's no such thing as a pleasure that's untainted by your beliefs about what you're being pleasured by." He used food as an example. If you hand me something and I tasted, part of my knowledge is that it was given to me by someone I trusted, and I would taste it differently than if I found it on the floor or if I paid $1,000 for it. Or take paintings. It's true that you can look at a painting and not know who painted it, and just appreciate it largely based on what it looks like. At the same time, you know it's a painting. In other words, he continued, it's not a natural occurrence of paint splattered on a wall. Somebody made it at some time for display, and that colors things. So too, he said, with the simplest of sensations, an orgasm, drinking water when you're thirsty, stretching, anything. It's always under some sort of description. It's always viewed as an instance of some sort of category. There is, in other words, always an implied narrative. The fact that pleasure is shaped by our sense of essence and thus by the stories we tell and the beliefs we hold about them suggests to Bloom that our pleasures are, in a sense, more profound than we may realize. There's always a depth to pleasure, he has written. But you could look at it the other way around. Given that our experience of a bottle of wine can be influenced by slapping a fake label on it, you might say that actually there is a superficiality to our pleasure, and that a deeper pleasure would come if we could somehow taste the wine itself, unencumbered by beliefs about it that may or may not be true. That is closer to the Buddhist view of the matter. The Man Without Stories. As Exhibit A, I give you the wine-tasting experience of Gary Weber. Weber is a compact, energetic, silver-haired man who has, over the decades, logged thousands and thousands of hours of meditative practice. By Weber's account, all this work has gotten him to a point where his day-to-day consciousness is very different than it used to be, and certainly different from, say, mine. He says his experience involves very little in the way of the self-referential thoughts that dominate the consciousness of most of us. Why did I say that stupid thing yesterday? How can I impress these people tomorrow? Can't wait to eat that chocolate bar, and so on. He calls these the emotionally laden I, me, my thoughts. We'll have to take Weber's word for it, what it's like to be him, but his claim to have achieved some rare state of consciousness does have a kind of corroboration. He participated in a landmark brain scan study at Yale Medical School that involved a number of highly accomplished, even renowned meditators. It's the study I alluded to in Chapter 4, the one that found the default mode network quieting down during deep meditation. But in Weber's case, the study found something different. His default mode network was quiet, very, very quiet from the get-go, before he even tried to meditate. Though I'm using Weber to illustrate the Buddhist idea of emptiness, I should concede that he is in some ways not well suited to that purpose. He did study extensively in the Zen Buddhist tradition, but he has also studied in and been influenced by Hindu traditions. And there are parts of Buddhism he rejects, the most important of which, for our purposes, is the term emptiness. He considers the term at best misleading. He says he's never known anybody who reached great contemplative depths and reported, "Oh, it's a big void." His own experience of the world is too rich to just call it empty without qualification. He says, "I've used words like empty fullness or full emptiness," he says. But whatever you want to call Weber's experience of the world, it sounds very much like what Rodney Smith describes, a world in which things don't have distinctive essences that set them sharply apart from one another. Though Weber, like Smith, can of course tell the difference between a chair and a table and a lamp and responds appropriately to each. These items don't project independent identities as forcefully as they used to. There's a continuity to things. There's not that differentiation between them and their background, Weber says. They're all one stuff. He sometimes describes this stuff they seem to be made of as a kind of energy, but there's no differentiation in energy or how you feel about them. I once tried to get Weber to elaborate on the nature of the enjoyment he gets from the world and how it differs from the enjoyment I get from the world. I said, "So you're saying, I gather, that there is a kind of pleasure that you can derive via your senses that does not constitute emotional involvement of a problematic kind." "That's correct," he said. But he hastened to add, "You haven't lost your nerve endings. Green tea still tastes like green tea. Red wine still tastes like red wine. You don't lose that. What you lose is the carry forward of that sensation. This is a fantastic glass of wine. This was a great year." But I pointed out that some people would say that if you don't at least consider it a good glass of wine, if you don't even get emotionally involved enough to like the wine, then there's not much point in living. He answered, "But it's a much cleaner perception. If I'm tasting a glass of wine and I'm trying to impress some restaurant critics or some friend who's a great wine fancier, then I may have a story going. I may have an expectation for how this wine should be and how I should expect it to taste, and so it really blocks my clear, simple perception. So by getting this thought out of the way, this emotional thought out of the way, I have a much higher likelihood of directly perceiving whatever the sensation is." Oddly, I kind of know what he means. When I've been on meditation retreats, sitting in the dining hall, savoring food, I've at times gotten so immersed in the flavors and textures that I wasn't really conscious of what I was eating, what fruit, what vegetable, whatever. I don't recall any story, in even the most basic sense, accompanying the sensation. What I do recall is the sensation feeling very good. Sometimes I think there are two different ways that essence can impede clear perception. In one case, the fantastic glass of wine case, the sense of essence is strong and evokes feelings that wouldn't be part of the essence-less experience. But sometimes the sense of essence is weak, so weak it tends to steer you away from the experience altogether. When I'm on retreat and I get immersed in the texture of a tree's bark, maybe that's because I don't have my usual essence of tree feeling, a feeling so devoid of power that it says, basically, it's just another tree, so you can walk right past it and move on to something more important. Through our sense of essence, we give things labels, and one use of labels is to file them away so you don't have to spend time on them. Maybe the reason babies get so immersed in shapes and textures is because they haven't yet developed their filing system, their sense of essence. In other words, they don't yet know what the things surrounding them are. So the world is a wonderland of exploration. And maybe this helps explain how Weber could say that emptiness is actually full. Sometimes not seeing essence lets you get drawn into the richness of things. Another way to put it is to say that in some cases, the story evoked by essence is a minimizing story. That's just a tree or just a piece of celery. But in other cases, the fantastic glass of wine case, the story is an amplifying story, so loud that it overwhelms intrinsic experience. Maybe essences can be labels that discourage experience altogether, or labels that encourage experience, but in some sense distort it. At any rate, that Weber equates having a strong emotional reaction to something with having a story about it makes sense to me, and so does the idea of jettisoning both the story and the emotion would tend to leave things with a less distinctive essence than they otherwise project. But is this really possible, stripping away the story, the background knowledge behind your sensory experience? And if so, what is going on in the brain when that happens? Stories and brain scans. A possible answer to the second question came from an experiment involving wine and a brain scanner. The experimenters gave people several different kinds of wine, labeled with several different prices, but two of the choices, the $90 bottle and the $10 bottle, were actually the same wine. People liked the $90 version better. No surprise there. What was interesting was what their brains did as they made these evaluations. When they drank wine from the $90 bottle, there was more activity in the medial orbitofrontal cortex, the MOFC, than when they drank the same wine with a $10 label affixed. The MOFC is a part of the brain whose activity is correlated with pleasure of various kinds, not just tastes, but aromas and music. This experiment suggests that it's also a part of the brain that's influenced by the story you've been told about the pleasure you're feeling and by the preconceptions this story gives you. The $90 story gets this part of the brain more excited than the $10 story. But there are also parts of the brain that play a role in pleasure and weren't influenced by the wine's price tag. Importantly, wrote the researchers, we did not find evidence for an effect of prices on the primary taste areas such as the insula cortex, the ventroposterior medial nucleus of the thalamus, or the parabrachial nuclei of the pons. A natural interpretation, they continued, is that the MOFC, the part of the brain that changed in response to the price tag, is where the top-down cognitive processes that encode the flavor expectations are integrated with the bottom-up sensory components of the wine. In other words, the MOFC seems to be where story, and hence expectation, mixes in with raw sensory data to modulate what the researchers called the hedonic experience of flavor. You might ask if wine drinking is really worth all this study. What does it matter if, as Weber suggests, the story-free consumption of wine is a purer, even pleasanter experience than the more common kind of drinking? Most wine drinkers strike me as pretty happy with the way their wine tastes, however laden it may be with dubious narratives. It's not as if deficient wine drinking is a looming global crisis. But the implications of all this go beyond wine. We're exploring the brain's capacity to create illusions. This particular experiment studied the specific illusion that the intrinsic taste of a beverage depends on the story that has been affixed to it. But that's just one example of a more general illusion, that the essences we sense in things really exist, that they inhabit the things we perceive when in fact they are constructions of our minds with no necessary correspondence to reality. Things come with stories, and the stories, whether true or false, shape how we feel about the things, and thus shape the things themselves, giving them the full form we perceive. In some contexts, this mental construction of essence can be way more consequential than whether wine tastes better with a $90 label than with a $10 label. That is the subject of the next chapter.